Okay, well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon on our series of webinars through our Sure Resource Center. I'm Brett Spear. I'm one of the co-directors of our Sure Resource Center, and I'm going to talk today about publications and their importance for R16 applications. This is actually a topic that sort of came up. Those of you who have participated in our webinars in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new, welcome. For this particular webinar, this came from some discussions I had with some faculty that talked about how challenging it is to find the time, for publications. I think this is a challenge for all of us. And so it seemed like maybe this would be a good way to a good discussion to have. And in a lot of ways, what I'm going to be doing today is sort of sharing from my perspective some of the issues that I've dealt with or struggled with as someone who's trying to publish as part of my daily routine. But hopefully there'll be a little bit of time, and at the end we can maybe share some practices as well, and you can maybe those of us who are here today can sort of share some of the challenges or some of the ways they sort of deal with finding time for publications. With this presentation is going to be being recorded. So Melissa, who's also with us today, Melissa Nickel, who's sort of the administrator for our Sure Resource Center, within a couple of days, she'll be able to post this on our YouTube channel. So you can also, if you want to, you can take a look at things afterwards as well. So what I'm going to try to do today, the objectives that I have for the next 45 minutes or so, is to really talk about the importance of peer-reviewed publications in different ways. Talk a little bit about some of the challenges in publishing our research findings and how to overcome them. And again, these are some of my suggestions based on my experience over the years. Talk a little bit about some of the different options for publishing, and then leave you with a list of reference materials. So in thinking a little bit about my history and my record in publishing, I went back to what sort of maybe my first, what I think of as my first publication. This goes back to when I was 10 years old. In fourth grade, our class was required to write a biography of someone that who we thought was really important. And at that time, I wanted to be an oceanographer. And so I wrote my first publication on Jacques Cousteau. And this, now I will say this was not peer reviewed, but my teacher, Mr. Klein, I think he really liked it, as I recall. At the time when I was younger, I went by my middle name, Thomas, rather than Brett. But I think one thing this does illustrate is the importance of having good visualization for your publications. Those of you, even if you don't know who Jacques Cousteau was, you probably can tell from this that he liked to go underwater. He liked to pick things up off the bottom of the ocean. You might notice from the flag that he was French. So one thing that has stayed with me through the years is the importance of having good images and figures for your publications. This was long before we had LinkedIn and Twitter and all, so I didn't have those listed, but if you wanted to find me, you could see that I was in room 220. I will say this, though, that my penmanship was pretty good when I was 10 years old, but it's gotten a lot worse. So if we move forward a little bit, to tell you a little bit more about myself, I've been a faculty member at University of Kentucky since 1989. I started graduate school in 1980, and since that time, I've had 92 publications. About half of these have been first author or senior author. Ironically, when I was growing up, I never really liked writing. I never liked English classes. I didn't like writing. But I always loved my science classes, and it's a little bit, I find a little ironic that now, so much of my career has been focused on writing and trying to, get publications, get grants through developing my writing skills. When I wrote my first manuscript in graduate school, my PhD advisor actually returned it to me without any corrections at all. He said it was so bad he didn't want to waste his time trying to improve it. So this is how sort of my writing career started. The second effort, the second draft that I sent to him was completely covered in red ink, which I consider to be an improvement. So it was a little bit of a rocky start. When I was writing my PhD dissertation, a postdoc in the lab next to mine actually offered to help me by editing it. And I was wise enough to take her up. And to me, this was a real aha moment. And that was simply to get advice from others who are better than you if you want to improve your skills. And so this is sort of where, for me at least, was my start of my path to better writing. And so, over the years, through a lot of practice and abundant advice from others, and I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have others to critique your writing and take heart with the comments that you get to improve your writing skills. I feel, at least for myself, I've transitioned from being a slow and poor writer to a slow and reasonably good writer. I still find writing to be a bit of a challenge, and it takes me time, but I think I am improving. So these days, even when my grant applications don't get funded, I often get comments that the grant was well written. So talk a little bit about the importance of peer-reviewed publications. And I think it's important in a number of different ways. First of all, it's important for you. It may be necessary for your career in different capacities, for promotion, for tenure, in other ways as well. So it's important for you to have peer-reviewed publications. And the bottom line too is it just feels great. I mean, I know there's a lot of highs and lows in our careers, but whenever I get a paper accepted for that gets accepted, that's always just a great feeling when that happens. So it's a positive for you. For your trainees, it looks great on a CV. It's going to make your trainees more competitive for future jobs, whatever they may be, whether they're going to be going on to grad school, professional school, looking for jobs. Showing that productivity through a publication is always going to be a real plus. And it's great training, especially if they're really involved with the process as well. And another thing I've noticed, at least with people that have worked in my lab, is that you can really see the confidence that comes when they're involved with publications or they see their name in print. And finally, we are all in some type of area of research, okay? And so our research is contributing to the body of work that collectively moves the field forward. So a lot of ways in which peer-reviewed publications are valuable, but really the focus today is, why are peer-reviewed publications important for NIH? And the bottom line is that productivity is an expectation for faculty who are supported by research grants through NIH. NIH, the funds that come to NIH are really taxpayer dollars that are coming to the government. NIH has to show the government there's evidence that the grant dollars are generating a tangible product. And really, their peer-reviewed articles are really that evidence that's a tangible product. Now, there's meeting abstracts, there's different ways in which you can get your data out there, but NIH still considers peer-reviewed publications as the gold standard to measure research productivity. Okay, so that fundamentally this is important. And then the other thing is that past publication record is a sign that you will turn your research findings into publications somewhere down the road. So keep that in mind as well. So regardless of where you are in your career, publications are important. But I will note that reviewers don't expect a robust population records from newer faculty that they might from faculty who have had more experience and have been doing research for longer periods of time. So there's a lot of different challenges in publishing our research findings. I don't have a doodle poll here. I don't have a poll or anything, but my guess is that if I were to ask those of us who are here today, what's your biggest challenge in putting a publication together? I'm pretty confident that for almost all of us, and not everyone, the biggest challenge is time. There's just not enough time with all the other responsibilities that we have on a day-to-day basis, is to find the time to really focus on taking our data and turning it into a manuscript and submitting that for publication. And the one thing I can say, I don't know if this is helpful or not, but we're not alone. Okay, there's a lot of data that's out there that strongly indicates that finding the time to put publications together and submit manuscripts is a challenge. And I've just listed several references here. There's many others, but this one publication, less than 50% of abstracts that were submitted to a specialty meeting were eventually submitted as a manuscript. And then a more comprehensive report down here from a couple of years ago, authors report lack of time is the main reason for unpublished research presented at biomedical conferences. So again, lack of time is by far the most important reason why data that we're generating in our labs is not actually getting published. So again, this is a little, maybe pertains to me, maybe it pertains to you as well, but I've listed here at least some of the challenges I've had in my career in terms of publishing my research findings. And the first one is that I work best under deadlines. I just, that I wish I could say that that was not the problem. I wish I could say I had, I was a little bit more focused in ability to do that, but deadlines are the best way I have to get things accomplished. And certainly when I was starting my research lab, I had some new students that were coming into my lab, and the students needed attention. And if I had to do something to help my students, to me, that was something that simply had to be done. I was preparing lectures for classes, and these were the first times I was teaching a lot of classes, and so I had to prepare my lectures, and so those lectures had to be prepared so that when that class came, I had to be ready for that. And then exams had to be graded so that I could get grades turned back to the students. For my position, I was expected to get external funding, so grants had to be written. So I did these things, and I could do them because they had to be done on a specific sort of time frame. And I will say that's over the years, I've really not had a lot of trouble writing grants and getting grants submitted, because I knew that if the deadline was Friday at 4:59 p.m. or 5 p.m. on a particular day on a Friday, if I had that grant, if I tried to submit it to NIH at 5:01, it was not going to get through. Okay, so having those deadlines was really a good way for me to get those grants submitted. But with papers, at least for me, was a little bit different. Yeah, I wanted to work on that paper. I had the data together, but there's not a firm deadline, so I'll work on that paper tomorrow. I got to take care of this. I've got to get ready for that class I have to teach, or I have to get this grant written. So this has always been a challenge for me. And then I would have to say that my first several years here as a faculty member, I actually wasn't getting my papers out. I was doing all the other things, and I remember sitting down with my chair, and he said, you're doing a lot of things well and all, but one of the expectations for promotion is that you're going to have some papers, and at least for that period of time, that was a motivation I needed. So I was able to really put my nose to the grindstone and get some papers submitted and accepted, and so that promotion and tenure went through. So that worked out well. But it still continues to be a challenge for me. Some of the in some ways, in terms of lectures and some things like that, I'm not doing a lot of new things, so that's not as much effort. People in my lab are trained now, so that's not a lot. But I still have other responsibilities. I've taken on leadership roles in different ways in my department in the college as well. And again, these are things that have to be done. So this can, finding the time and really focusing on what's needed to get publications out continues to be a challenge. Another challenge that I've seen, and maybe not with me so much, but with a few people that have worked in my lab, perfection is the enemy of good. I've had several students in my lab that just, they want to get that perfect piece of data where everything works out well. We might have a Western blot that has, 12 lanes on it, 15 lanes or everything, and wants everything to look perfect. And that's a challenge. I think, to really have something that looks perfect, it can really take a lot of time. So certainly the quality of the data matters. It matters to you. It matters to the reviewers, whether it's in a grant or in a paper. They're going to be looking at reviewing the data that you're presenting. So quality is important. Data has to be significant. You have to, perform experiments sufficiently and carry out the appropriate statistics to know whether or not the data is significant or not. And you have to be confident in your conclusions. If you think something is happening and you've repeated the experiment enough and you've done the statistical analysis and you really feel that, I'm confident that in this conclusion, then that's good. But at the same time, it's rare that data is going to look 100% perfect. And I think there has to be a time when you say, okay, this is believable, this is high enough quality, it's time to move forward. And I must say, I've had a couple of students, and in particular, I had one really talented student in terms of, what she was able to do in the lab, and she really kept up with literature. She read a lot, but she really didn't move forward a lot because she just had a tendency to try to repeat experiments, too often to get everything that looked just perfectly fine. So I think that can be another challenge that some people have. And finally, if we're working in labs, and I consider myself one of those labs that really a lot of the research is being done by students, students are busy. They're doing research maybe, but they're also taking classes. They have other commitments as well. So that's that, they can only devote so much effort to the research itself. And I've had a lot of great undergraduates that have worked in my lab over the years. But sometimes they're in the lab for maybe a year or maybe even a summer or a semester. Sometimes I've had students that have been in the lab for a couple of years. But one of the challenges is that a lot of the people, at least that have worked in my lab, have been in the lab for a relatively short period of time. So I think that can be another issue as well, in terms of bringing your data and bringing your research to the point where you're ready to publish. So how to overcome challenges so that you can publish your research. And I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about what I've done and what's worked for me. But I think what's really important is that you have to develop a strategy that fits your style, and whatever that style is, that you stick to it. So what I like to do is I like to have my figures and tables assembled in a way that they're going to be presented in a figure. I mean, in a manuscript, okay? And these don't necessarily have to be the final, figures. I mean, there's many times when we get data and we know what the data is telling us, but again, it may not be publication quality, but it tells us what we think is happening. And so we're ready to sort of move forward with it, at least to start, sort of putting together how we want that data to look, or how we want a manuscript to look. So that's one thing I like to do to really get the process started for me. I know that I'm most effective in the morning at writing. As the day goes on, I get distracted and I'm simply not as effective later. So, for me, I really try to take the time early in the day when I know that I'm sort of at my maximal capacity for really focusing on the writing and getting some work done. Okay, so that's another thing. When I first started writing papers, I just sort of followed sort of the standard the way the paper was where you would read a paper. So I'd start off with the introduction, and then I'd sort of move on to the methods, and I'd sort of go through that way. At least for me, I found that was really not very efficient. So what I found works best for me is that I start off with the results section. So I've already sort of gotten my idea of what the figures are going to look like, and tables, so I know where they are, what they look like, how we're going to go from figure 1 to 2, so on and so forth. So I have that. So I start off with the results section, and I like to get that completed. And after that's done, then I move on to the introduction and the discussion components. And one reason I think this helps for me is that it really, by having the results that are shown there, when I get back to the introduction, it helps me focus the introduction on what's important for the data itself or for the results themselves. So initially, when I'd start off with the introduction, then I do the results section, I go back and I'd see that half of the information that I sort of had put into my introduction really wasn't relevant to the data that I was showing. So for me, using this strategy has helped me sort of streamline the process. So start with the results, then I go to the introduction and the discussion so that it really focuses on topics that are highly relevant to the data that's being presented. And then I actually finish, I get to the methods, which I find is sort of pretty straightforward. And then when I have everything together, then I put together the abstract. One thing I've tried to follow over the years comes from guy named Bob Perry, who was a faculty member at Fox Chase Cancer Center, where I started out as a postdoc. He wrote beautiful papers, and he was just an outstanding writer, but a really interesting guy as well. But one of the things I remember him saying once is that the amount of speculation should be proportional to the amount of data, and that the discussion section should be 1/3 the length of the results. Now, I don't know if I've ever, if I fully adhere to that, but I do think there's, I find there a lot of truth in this. So, I do try to really keep the speculation or keep the discussion section of my papers, really to focus on as much as I can, and to make sure the discussion section doesn't get too long. And I've noticed over the years as I've read papers, and sometimes I'll see discussion sections that are 2 or 3 times as long as the results section, and they tend to go off in areas that are really sort of irrelevant as well. So for me, these are some nice practices to help me stay focused on what I really should be working on. I think I find balancing my efforts to keep mentally fresh are really important. There's some days that I really, even if I only have a couple of hours that I can put into writing, I can really crank it out. I'm really, my mind is really focused, and I can get stuff done, and that works out great. But at the same time, there are times when for whatever reason, it's just not clicking. And sometimes on those days, what I'll do is that maybe I'll go and I'll look at some of my figures, and I'll try to think of different ways of putting the data together in the figures, and trying to assemble those final figures so that they really look good. So I feel like I'm contributing to the paper itself, even though it doesn't take that sort of level of focus and that level of sort of mental energy that's really necessary, at least for me, to really be effective at actually writing. And then for the other thing I think that's really important is you just got to get words on paper or words on the computer screen. I at times, or at least early on, I used to feel like I had to sort of put that perfect sentence down, and really what I was putting on paper the first time around really had to be the final product. And what I found was that I was just sitting around not doing anything a lot for a while. So what I've learned is that I've just got to really get the words onto the paper or on the computer screen, and then prepare to edit and to edit over and over again, to sort of go from that initial product to that final polished product. And for me, that polishing really does require multiple rounds of editing to get to the point where I'm comfortable with what I've actually put together. So, and your strategies might be very different, but these are some of the things that, at least for me, that I found over the years is the best way that I can really use my time effectively to get papers together, get manuscripts together, and ready for publication. One thing I like to do is to put a storyboard together. I talked about a minute ago about how I like to put my figures together. This is just a picture from the whiteboard in where we have our lab meetings. So people in the lab, we're generating data, we're working on projects together, and there comes a point where we say, okay, we can see a paper coming together here. Let's again, this comes from a lab meeting. Let's see how we can assemble the data to make a story. And this, after the end of it, I often will take a picture of it so I have a good memory of what we've done. But to me, what it does is that again, it sort of puts the framework together for what that paper is going to be. And in this case, we have this was a gene that we had discovered in our lab a number of years ago that involved, it's a transcription factor, and we had made a knockout mouse. And so, we're going to sort of make a diagram of the gene itself, and we are doing a tumor study here. So we just sort of, decided, okay, how are we going to, assemble this data to make a story? And I think it's really important to always think of your papers as a story that you're telling that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And, we talked about that. We sort of noted areas that we needed some more work. We needed that for some of the images that we had to get a pathologist to do some analysis. Even though some of the data wasn't complete yet, we had some Western data that we needed to get higher quality data for a publication, but we sort of knew what was going on, and we already had some RNA data. So we had a pretty good idea what this was going to look like. So even though we didn't have everything perfectly ready to go, this was sufficient so that we could start doing the writing. And so this is a way that with many of the papers we've written, especially with the students, we're several of us are all putting data to, generating data to contribute. We sort of put everything together here, and then it shows us what we have, and it also shows us what we still need to do to fill in the gaps. Some of the other challenges and things that I've learned over the years, first of all, I think it's really important to keep good track of your students' data. You know where the primary data exists, and make sure that your students know how to manage and store their data, whether it's in hard copy in notebooks or whether you do it electronically. In my lab we do it both. We do have the notebooks and all, but especially a lot of the data, the RNA analysis, and a lot of the images that we generate, we maintain those electronically as well. And I think this is really important, especially if you have students that are, in the lab for a year or a short period of time, and then they move on and they might graduate, and then you can't really contact them. So it's really important to know where that primary data exists, with the hope that someday down the road it's going to turn into data that's going to be in a manuscript. So I think that's really important. And I find that when students come into my lab, it's really important to train them well right from the beginning about how to, keep a good notebook, to keep things neat, and to manage and store their data so that others can find that when necessary. I think another thing is to be realistic about what can be accomplished. And I've learned, through my experience, that using methods and technologies that can be readily mastered by students is really important. We do some things in the lab that are a little bit more sophisticated, but and sometimes students can develop those skills, but especially if students are coming in and they don't have a lot of experience, to do some things or learn how to do some techniques that allow them to generate data and contributing and learning, but really aren't that complicated. So I think that's really important. I list a publication here that I published that goes back to 1995, a few years ago. But I put this here because the first couple of years I had a lab, and I had a couple of undergrads in the lab, and I had a graduate student, and we were sort of working on a lot of different things. And I found out that the students were sort of learning things, but it wasn't really cohesive. And so we started a project, and the idea here was to do some cloning. And early on, when I was here, we did a lot of cloning, but we had developed a LAC-Z-based strategy for analyzing transcriptional control elements. And all the work that was done were done by Tracy Longley, Scott Mulder, and Steve Wong. These were all undergrads who were working in the lab, and Martha Peterson's a longtime collaborator. And so this publication actually had 3 of the authors here were all undergrad students that worked on this project, and they all could learn the skills to do cloning. And so I found that having students do things that were within their sort of level of expertise was really beneficial to them, and actually helped us move projects forward. And then the last thing I'll say to consider is using resources that go beyond the lab itself. Establishing collaborations. I've been very successful a couple of times with having collaborations with others that really have allowed me to expand my research productivity through working with others that had skills and technologies and resources that I did not have in my lab, and that was really good. And I also point out that I know that when I was writing papers, writing manuscripts with collaborators, I was always a lot better at getting that writing done, because I knew that my collaborator needed me to finish this work so that they could do what they were doing as well. So I always was better at writing when I was working in a collaborative manuscript rather than just working one that was coming out of my lab itself. So that's one thing you can do to overcome challenges in publishing through collaborations. Reaching out to others for reagents and samples. I think it's not going to be across the board, but most times people, if you ask for some type of reagents or samples, antibodies, clones, whatever that might be, reagents, ask for things, and I think you'd be for the most part, people are really very, very willing to share with their resources with others. And then finally, using facilities that might contribute to your research. I know that, if you are in an idea state, most of the idea states, if not all, have in-breed networks, and there's a lot of core facilities that are supported by these networks. take advantage of these core facilities to have the work that can help carry out the work. Maybe you're close to another institution, a large institution that may have some resources or some core facilities that may help you as well. So, look at other ways beyond your lab and your own institution that may help you carry out the research and get the work done. I'm just going to take a little detour for a second and emphasize the importance of data and showing data that looks good and is and conveys the message that you want to convey. And with all papers, to keep in mind that it's the data that really drives the story. This is a figure from one of a paper that we published several years ago, and this is ZHX2. We don't go into great details, but ZHX2 is a transcription factor that we had some evidence that it regulated expression of a class of proteins called mouse urinary proteins. And so we wanted to show that when ZHX2 gene was knocked out, the expression of the mouse urinary proteins went down. So this was one of the figures from that paper. And the points I want to emphasize: figures should be clearly labeled with readable fonts. I like to always begin my figure legend with a one-sentence summary of what the data shows. And then I always like to have figure legends that fully describe the figure itself, so that if a person just looks at the figure and then reads the figure legend, they should have a pretty good idea of what this data is showing. Now, in many cases, you're going to have some redundancy between what's in the figure legend and what's with the text of the results section itself, but I think to an extent that's okay. So I just want to emphasize how important it is to have really clean, easily readable, pleasant data, again, very easy for the reviewers or anyone reading that data to look at how important that is. And then I wanted to show this as well. Actually, I teach a class about, one of the classes I teach is about reading papers and how to analyze or evaluate data that's in papers. And this is actually some data from a paper that we use as sort of a bad example of data in a paper. So what are some of the problems in this paper? And these are some northern blots or western blots that are being shown here. And the students are pretty good at figuring this out. But first of all, they see that the gels are really cropped here. So that's sort of a red flag if you're looking at things and you wonder why they've cropped gels so much. That's one issue. You can see here that this in figure 1A and figure 2 here, the time points are different. And if you read the text of this particular paper, they're really comparing the time points between these two figures, but they don't even have, some of the same time points for this short time course study. You see here that in A, that's the wild type on the left and stat knockout on the right. Well, here stat knockout is on the left and wild type. And maybe not huge things, but again, these are just things that are a little bit sloppy and maybe cause some concern for reviewers if they're evaluating your manuscript. I also point out that the gap DH, or it's supposed to be gap DH here, is a little bit off here. These are supposed to be to normalize. There's actually several other figures in the paper that are a lot worse than this. So anyway, and next month we're going to have a webinar. Sarah D'Orazio is going to talk about the importance of figures in grants and papers. So she's going to get into these topics in much greater detail, and I think that's going to really be important because the quality of figures really is important, whether it's a manuscript or a grant application. So keep that in mind, and we'll talk about this in greater detail next month. Okay, so I want to change gears a little bit and talk a little bit about options that you might have or might want to consider for your manuscripts. I think most of us are familiar with standard journals. These are, sort of the traditional journals that, we see that are hard copy, although things are more and more online these days. These are your peer-reviewed manuscript, have peer-reviewed papers that are in these journals. Revenue for these journals either come from journal subscriptions or publication or journal fees. And normally for these types of journals, the quality and the impact are both considered in terms of, determining whether a paper should be considered for acceptance or not. But we've seen over the last, maybe 10 years or so, a little bit longer, there's new ways of options for publishing data as well. And one of those areas are open access journals. And again, there's hundreds and thousands really of journals that are in these different categories, But open access journals, they in general, at least the good ones, are peer reviewed. So there is a peer review process to determine whether or not a paper should be accepted for publication. These are open access. Revenue comes from publication fees. In general, authors usually retain copyright, which can be different than standard journals, where oftentimes in these situations, the journals own the copyright to what's there. So that's a thing to consider. With many of the open access journals, quality is often more important than just impact or novelty. So if a study is done carefully, if the data is, rigorously analyzed and the conclusions are consistent with the data, that's the main criteria. So whether or not it's a major research finding or not is not as significant. And I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of these journals, like the PLOS journals, the Frontiers journals, MDPI. These are some of the better known open access journals. So this is another strategy that you might want to consider for publishing. A lot of times the citations in journals or articles published in these types of journals is high because these are open access. So people around the world can readily see these articles, whereas sometimes papers in standard journals, if people don't have access to those journals, they don't see the articles. So this is something to consider. Costs sometimes can be pretty high for here. So there are some issues as well, but I think this is another avenue to consider for publication. Now, on the flip side, there are another class of journals out there called predatory journals. And these are types of journals you want to stay away from. These generally are very profit-driven journals that oftentimes have absolutely no peer review. They're willing to take in and accept any article that is submitted because they can charge fees. So regardless of the quality of the work, they'll publish it. These types of journals generally have a very low rejection rate. Oftentimes the costs that you're going to have to pay are often hidden until after the paper is published. The representation for these journals is often very misleading. They market aggressively through email, and there's little or no editing. So a lot of time there's errors in these types of papers. I know that I get a lot of emails from a number of these different journals asking me to publish. Again, these are unsolicited emails. So there's hundreds of predatory journals out there. I've got some links that I'll put at the end that gives you a little bit more information about these types of journals and how to avoid them. But the last thing I want to mention, and this is sort of a different class altogether, and these are preprint repositories. And these have come up relatively recently. These are ways that you can, if you have a manuscript that's about ready or ready for publication, you can deposit your preprint in these types of repositories. There's no fee to do so. They're not peer reviewed and they're open access. So it gets your information or gets your manuscripts out there for others to see, and it's very fast. And that can be an advantage over other types of journals that may take time before an article gets reviewed and accepted for publication. So it's a quick way to get your manuscript out there. In most cases, not always, but most cases, your manuscript that's submitted to a preprint repository can be published in peer-reviewed journals. So that's something to think about as well. I don't really have the time to go into all the pros and cons with preprint repositories, but I think that's something you should think about. And one of the really important reasons is because articles that are in preprint servers can actually be cited in NIH grants. So if you're submitting a grant, you have your biosketch, you can actually put your manuscripts that are in preprint repositories, you can actually put those in your NIH biosketch, and it'll be considered a publication. And so I think that's one reason it's really important. There's one called BioRxiv, which is run through the Cold Spring Harbor Labs, and we've submitted several papers to this repository. And in the cases I've done it, I've subsequently published in other journals as well. So I think it's something you want to think about. And you always want to consider the different ways that you can sort of look to see whether or not journals are on Scopus, Medline, or Altmetric. These are some of the different types of online services to look at journals. So a lot of things like predatory journals are not going to be found in these types of online databases. So keep that in mind too. Some things to think about in finding a journal for your work. First of all, learn about the different journals that you're considering, know what the scope of the journal is, and know what their requirements are. What are their requirements for primary data? And this is a very fast moving area of publications right now. Some journals, want to be able to have access to the primary data that that's maybe different, than the finished data that you're putting together in an actual figure. What are their requirements in terms of supplemental data, large data sets? So you're going to want to know this information when you're looking at potential journals for your manuscripts. It's really important to carefully review the instructions for authors so that you follow the guidelines, whatever they might be for that journal. Certainly reviewing, the editorial board and see who's on the editorial board can maybe give you some idea whether or not this is an appropriate journal for you, because if the people on the editorial board are doing the same kind of research as you, that might be a good sign. You probably want to look at publication costs, application rates, time to publication. These are all some things that are going to play into your decisions about whether or not you're going to want to consider submitting your paper to a particular journal. And what I think I find is just to take a look at current articles. What are the general lengths of these articles? What is the format? What numbers of figures are sort of expected here? And again, it varies from journal to journal. And by getting this information, that can give you some insight whether or not this might be the right place for you to submit your paper for review. And then obviously, talk to colleagues, get some ideas from others who might have some of this experience, and give some guidelines of where you might want to consider as well. The last thing I put here is the impact factor. Journals are rated by impact factor based on the papers and how frequently those papers are cited by other papers. I sort of have mixed feelings about this. I think impact factors can be of value, but sometimes it can be a little misleading as well. So I don't take this very seriously. I think if you're publishing in a reputable journal, I think that's really important. That's what's important here. In my experience as a grant reviewer, I think impact factor does not have a huge, influence on reviewers when they're looking at productivity of the applicant. So take this with a grain of salt. Like I said, for me, it's not as important, but I know for other people, they do really consider impact factor as being a really important criteria in considering a journal. And I want to finish on the last topic, and that is, getting your article unrejected. And I really like this phrase. I was talking to a friend once, a colleague, about at a meeting, and we were just talking about some of the challenges of publishing. And I can't remember ever submitting a manuscript for publication where it didn't come back with something that had to be done to fix it. I don't know if I've ever gotten any paper that said, "This is great, we're going to accept it as it is." There's always something. And he liked to use the term unrejected. So the process of getting a paper accepted is really a process of getting it unrejected. So here are some thoughts. First of all, develop a thick skin. I think in science, whether it's with grants or papers, we have to accept the fact that we're going to get rejection. And so I think that's one of the first things you just sort of have to accept. I get frustrated when my papers aren't accepted, but I move on. I try to move on as fast as I can. But take a careful look at the critiques. Sometimes a journal is simply not going to consider the paper for whatever reason, but sometimes they will consider it, consider a resubmission. And if that's the case, look at the critiques. Know exactly what is expected for you to turn that paper from a paper that wasn't accepted over that line so that it's accepted. What are the expectations? Are they reasonable? Are additional data needed, or is it just maybe some editing that's necessary? If additional data is needed, maybe you have some of that data already that you've done in the lab, so it's relatively quick turnaround time. But maybe you're going to have to do more experiments based on what's wanted. So you have to really take a look at what's expected to get a paper unrejected. Can you address those concerns, and if so, can you do so in the required time frame? And if not, don't think that time frame's hard. I mean, I've had a number of situations where I've asked if I could extend the time frame a little bit so we could do the experiment so that we could get the paper resubmitted. So if you can't do whatever is necessary in the time frame, you can request an extension. This last one is sort of a strange one. Consider emailing the editor advice. This is sort of hit or miss, and again, I don't know if I feel real strongly about this, but I will say a couple of papers ago, we submitted a paper. It did not get accepted, but the reviewers had several things that they wanted to see done for resubmission. And so, we sort of talked about it in the lab a little bit. They wanted some more data, and I just sort of decided, that one of the people that was really working on the project had graduated, so she had moved on. And I emailed the editor and I said, appreciate the advice and the comments of the reviewers, but I'm going to have to, just move on to a different journal because I've decided we just can't get these experiments done as the reviewers wanted. Actually, the editor emailed back and sort of said, well, I think there's some positives here too, and they mentioned a lot of things that they like. So, if you can do some of the other things that the reviewers wanted, we'll consider, a resubmission. And so I went ahead and resubmitted it, and the paper did get accepted. So, that, I must say, that surprised me a little bit, but it did change my thinking about how I might deal with papers in the future. Always, I always feel it's important to get input from others, especially if others that have had a lot more experience than you with getting papers accepted. Get their input, let them look at the critiques, and they might be able to see things in a critique that you might not see if you haven't had a lot of experience. And then finally, if for whatever reason you can't address the concerns or the paper, they don't want to consider a resubmission, move on, just let it go, reformat it, and resubmit it to a different journal, and just don't sort of dwell on the frustration. So having said all that, I just share some final thoughts. First of all, the mechanisms for exchanging data are changing rapidly, and so it's going to be interesting to see how things progress over the next couple of years. But having said that, I still think that peer-reviewed publications will continue to be evaluated as a key measure of research productivity for NIH grants. If you do submit an application to NIH, whether it's an R16 grant or otherwise, and if one of the critiques is that there's weak productivity, you almost, I wouldn't say it's required, but it's almost required that you have to try to get a publication out there. If this is considered to be a weakness, if you resubmit the grant, the new reviewers are going to see the critiques, and they're going to see that one of the weaknesses is weak productivity. And if you haven't addressed that through, say, some type of publication or submission, then that's going to continue to be a weakness. So on the flip side, if the critique is that you're weak productivity and you can get a paper published, then bam, you've addressed that concern. So that can be a real positive. So keep that in mind. And then finally, if a grant is funded and you're working on the project, productivity will be evaluated if you decide that you're going to renew that grant application, 3-4 years down the road. How many publications are really necessary? That I know that's really hard to say. I would say if you're doing an R01 level grant, you should strive for probably at least 2 publications each year for an R01. It's still a little too early to say for R16 grants since this is a new program, but I think if you were to get 1 or maybe close to 1 publication per year with an R16 grant and you go in for a renewal, I would think that the reviewers would consider that to be reasonably good productivity for that type of grant. So keep that in mind as well. And I'll just finish with some reference materials, but I've listed here some different things to look at regarding what I've talked about today. I thought this is sort of nice. It has a guide to getting published in journals. It's a pretty lengthy site that talks about a lot of different issues with publishing. I've listed the idea networks. I talked a little bit about that if you're in an idea state. Some information about open access journals and preprint servers. Again, a little bit, some of the pros and cons if you're thinking about doing preprints. I put the link for the BioRxiv. I'm not necessarily saying this is better than some of the others that are out there. It's just one that I'm familiar with. Allmetric is a online way that you can sort of look at journals and the quality of journals in terms of the types of papers that they publish. as well as an article that came out a couple of years ago that talked a little bit about predatory journals. And I'll sort of stop there and I'll stop sharing, and then I'd be happy to answer questions. Dr. Murphy is here as well, our co-director. He's had an active, long career of publishing as well, and so he has, I'm sure, his experience too and his ideas about things. So we'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay. First question is asking, the model you suggest involves the PI writing the papers. While this is most likely most efficient, how do you reconcile this with our duty to teach doctoral students and postdocs how to write papers?
That's a great question. And that is a huge struggle, because it is, you know, I find that it's easier myself to do these things rather than you know, the students or postdocs. One way I've done that is that, I mean, sometimes if a student is especially with graduate students that I've had, I really have only had a couple of postdocs, is that they'll be primarily responsible for writing papers. But one thing I've done is to give people different sections. So, you know, I'll tell the student, you know, I want you to write this part of the paper. So you've done the figures 2 and 3 on this paper come from you. I want you to write this component to describe those figures. And so I chop it up into little bits and pieces like that, and give them some things to do without making it so overwhelming that it just takes forever and it's too heavy of a lift. So that's one way I've done things a little bit to get students involved without making it their sole responsibility. Paul, have you had advice?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you need to do with your students is to be honest about their capabilities. Some people write really well, some people do not. Some people write really fast, some people write slow. And you just need to know what is something that they can handle, and do they have time to do it? Because if they have a lot of obligations, if they're TAing, if they have classes to take still, it might be a struggle for them to get stuff done. So you need to be realistic about, if it's a short paper, you know, they might be able to do it in a couple of weeks, or they might not. It's just and you know, you probably will not know. And if you haven't had a student if you haven't had them write something with you before, you may not know until you actually get them to do something. So you just have to be prepared to switch it up if it's not going to work. So if you think, oh, that'd be fine, and then they start writing something, and you know, and it's been a month and they haven't given you a single word, you should probably talk to them and see, you know, do they think they just don't have time, or what's the issue? I mean, there's lots of different scenarios that can come up, but you do have to be flexible, I think, with students.
A lot of times with my students, when they first start working on projects, they're normally like a co-author on someone else's paper, so they don't have to take the lead on it, so they can be involved with a little bit, and they can be involved with editing, you know, a version of the paper, so they get a little of experience. But by the time they're moving on and they're close to finishing up their career, then, you know, they really have to take the lead in writing those papers, and it can be a challenge for everyone. But yeah, it is part of our responsibility that they have to learn how to develop those writing skills too.
Okay. The next question is asking, how do you identify predatory journals? Follow-up comment, I always ignore those journals which send me emails to publish.
I just ignore all the emails, Mike. I've never responded to an email. If someone emails me and says, I'd like you to publish, to me, that's like, you know, unsolicited email. I don't bother with that. So I've never responded to anything that an unsolicited request to publish in the journal.
Yeah, those are generally not a good sign. Now, there is an exception to that. So occasionally you will get something for an invite for a special issue to something. Those are legit. They do take your time. So you make sure that it's something you want to commit to. There are a lot of these. So, I mean, you have to think, is this something that you would fit with? And, you know, the person who's handling a special issue, Frontiers journals do these all the time, but lots of other journals do them as well. And you just have to see who is the editor in charge of that one. And you should ask them what are the other authors that are going to submit, because special issue things will often contain both review articles as well as relevant data papers. So it is an opportunity sometimes to get some of your work published with a bit of a lower resistance threshold, because they'll have a timeline and they'll be much more amenable to you, like maybe saying, well, I don't want to do those experiments because of this. And because they have a deadline, they're more flexible. So you do have an advantage to those. And if it comes from something like Elsevier does a lot of these and Frontiers does, those are legit companies. So I mean, those are not predatory. Again, it's going to be a time commitment. So you have to know, is it going to be worth it? So asking what other people have agreed to submit something to the same journal, and what the timeline is and what the expectations are, getting that up front is helpful.
Okay, next question asks, what is the advantage of preprint repositories? Is it considered a publication for grants and tenure? And if so, why try to publish it after in a peer-reviewed journal?
Well, so I think for tenure, it depends on, that would probably depend from institution to institution. So I can't talk to that. But in terms of NIH grants, you can put something from a preprint repository. You can include that in your bio sketch. So they consider that a publication. But it's not peer reviewed. I think for long-term impact, I think that ultimately you would like to get a paper published in a peer reviewed journal. And so I think that should be what you really strive for.
So I think the way that you would, the issue is with preprints is because the bar is very, very low for what you could put into a preprint. And if someone's reviewing it on a grant application, because it hasn't, and a lot of preprints have no comments with them. So it's not like, oh, it's out there and people will comment on it. A lot of people are not looking at them. So the issue with that is it's nice to see that you put something out there that someone can look at, but in terms of how it would impact both your biosketch and your grant productivity long-term, if you look at someone's biosketch and they have something on there that's listed as a preprint and it's been a preprint for 4 years, that's not going to be a real thing, right? It's like, but if it's something like you have a preprint, it's in the last year, that's fine. I mean, I would consider that to be legit. Yeah. But it's just, I wouldn't expect it to be a 3-year-old preprint because that's like, it's not a real, it should be a real paper by this point, right? It's like an abstract. You stick an abstract out there, and if you never publish it, it's not really, it's nice that you presented it somewhere, but it doesn't really count as much.
Yeah. The one thing I put on the last page about the pros and cons, that gives you a really good insight about some of the reasons you might want to consider it, but also some of the cons as well. So I would suggest take a look at that. Yeah.
Next question says, how does NIH evaluate short papers compared with regular articles published in peer-reviewed journals?
Well, again, I mean, there is a balance, and different reviewers are going to look at articles differently. Obviously a robust full article that has a lot of information in it might be viewed a little stronger, but at the same time, maybe some reviewers don't really look that carefully at the article itself. So they might not really look to see what's the difference between the two. But
yeah, both are true.
Yeah, I think mostly, it's getting something published is considered to be a success.
Okay. Next question is asking, do you send an email to an editor before manuscript submission to see if there is any interest for publication?
Okay, well, I can put on my editor and hat for this. So it is always important, if you're writing a review article, you need to contact an editor, because a lot of times I'll reject unsolicited review articles out of hand if I haven't asked for it, right? If you're a very established PI, you've been around for a while and you already have a really high H index and you're really well known, and you just send me a review article because you have a proven track record, I might consider it. But if you're going to send a review article and you're relatively new to an area, you should ask. If it's a novel idea, I mean, it might think, oh, sure, you can submit it. But if it's just like an ordinary review in a field that's well trodden, you probably just get it rejected. So it's not worth your time. Now, for data papers, the issue with sending a letter to the editor is the only thing that they'll be able to comment on is really whether it's within the scope of the journal. Until they see the full paper, they won't really know if it looks like it's worth reviewing or not. So you can usually tell if something's within the scope of a journal just by reading the description of the scope of the journal. So it's not super helpful. That's just my opinion. I don't think so. Brett?
Yeah, so I don't know if I would strongly recommend it to, but there are some really high impact journals that, the editors will just take a look and say, we're not even going to send this out for review. If you look at some of the Nature and Cell journals, sometimes, they just won't even send something out. They'll take a look at it and say, this isn't within our scope. So, and maybe in those situations, a little email would help, but
Yeah, for very high impact journals, it could help because they can at least comment on whether they think it's novel enough to look at.
yeah.
Right. But they can reject it within a day. For a lot of journals though, the desk reject rate is very high. So I'm the editor for molecular bases of disease, and our desk reject rate is about 75 to 80%. So this is stuff we don't send out for reviews. And lots of journals are like that now.
Yeah.
I mean, but we also don't require you. We let, and most Elsevier journals are like that, where they do a your paper your way thing. So they don't care about the formatting at that stage. So you don't have to keep reformatting stuff. You can just send the whole paper if you've already written it and say here, and then at least you don't have to waste your time of sending a letter saying, are you interested? And they say, sure, I don't know, whatever, your abstract seems okay. And then you send it in, and then you reject it anyway. Right.
Good thought. Good question.
Okay, next question is asking if you have any advice for research clinicians who want to start publishing. Any advice on a good way to start?
I don't know if trying to do some case studies to get some things out there that you have already to do that. Maybe seeing if you could hook up with a basic scientist and try to take some clinical data and combine it with some basic research to try to put a paper together. Maybe that's something to think about. I worked with a person in our liver transplant group a couple of years ago that wanted to get started, and we did some stuff together and got some papers published, and it was a combination of some clinical work that he had done, and we did some tissue culture studies to sort of offset what he was doing. So those are a couple of thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, I think collaborative efforts are good. Right, because if you're just getting started, you need someone to help you get something off the ground, because it's good to, combining some clinical expertise with some bench science is pretty helpful, because you can make some interesting projects from that.
Okay, along the same lines, do you have any suggestions for junior faculty who are in a setting with limited resources?
I would also say look at ways you can collaborate. Are there ways that you can collaborate, whether it's at your institution or if there's not many options there, trying to find people at other institutions that who have experience in technologies and resources that could complement what you're doing. I know that sometimes it's hard to find those people, whether you could try to go to meetings and reach out to people or just through email if you could try to connect with somebody. But I think collaborations can be a really good way to maybe get things, off the ground.
Next question says, does the NIH review panel value MDPI journal publications similar to publications in standard journals?
In my panels, I've never seen anyone make comment about one way or the other. I mean, if someone has a paper in Cell or Nature, a reviewer might say something about that. But in terms of others, I haven't seen it. I don't know, Paul, have you?
No, I mean, generally speaking, you have really high impact papers if people say something in review like this PI recently had a really nice paper in Nature Medicine, right? So if it's really an exceptional one, they'll mention that as an exceptional thing. Everything else, for the most part, is considered just evidence of a good publication track record. Yeah, I mean, I've never seen anyone single out something and said, like, this is a paper in this impact factor 2 journal. It's like no one, because one of the things, if someone says that, I mean, on a study section, it would say, that's being unfair. I mean, you want to actually, you shouldn't really say things like that without looking at the paper, because there is some really nice work in regular sort of standard archival journals. There's lots of journals in that normal sort of impact range, and they're all fine. I mean, I don't think you can't really criticize something without looking at it.
Okay. Next question. What is your comment to do a graphic abstract? Many journals are asking about it. Do you suggest any computer-assisted resource?
Well, yeah, you're right. There are more and more that are asking. There's something called bio-render, which is something that you can use, but that does cost money. I don't know exactly what the fee is, but that's one way you can sort of make nice graphics. I've done a couple of things where I've simply, done things on PowerPoint and put something together using that. Maybe not the highest quality and all, but it has worked. Those are a few thoughts I would have.
Okay. Next question says, what strategies or tips do you have for faculty from an MSI where the teaching load is high, especially when their major workforce is undergraduate or master's grad students, and the faculty has to play multiple roles? So the PI, postdoc, so forth in their own research lab. This ultimately reduces our reading and manuscript writing time, but is not considered as an exception.
Well, I mean, there are two things of that. One is really good time management, and the second one is to make good use of time when you are not teaching. So if you're on like a 9 or 10 month appointment, try to get some of the writing done. If you're efficient and you manage your time well, you can squeeze in something that, if you've organized everything ahead of time, you can squeeze in a block during the summer that won't eat into too much of your summer. That's how a lot of people handle that.
Yeah. This is, again, I really appreciate that this is a huge challenge with, especially when you have such a huge teaching load. I one thing I can say for myself, I was in a lab when I was a postdoc where it was a large lab. We had a lot of postdocs. These were, we had like 15 postdocs, everyone working, totally 100% effort on research. And boy, the things you could do in that lab were different. Then I come to my current situation. I have a couple of undergrads. And so one thing I did, I just had to be realistic about what we could accomplish. And there's no way I could accomplish the kinds of things that I was doing previously. So I tried to channel the kind of projects we had to things that were realistic and could be accomplished, by students that had more limited experience. And that's one way. I think we were able to successfully get some papers out. Again, maybe they weren't going to set the world on fire, but it did show some productivity.
Okay, just a quick comment. We do have several questions left, and so we're going to stay online and address those. But if you need to leave, do know that we're going to continue recording the Q&A, and it will be available on YouTube shortly. Next question is a multi-part question. It says, I'm also wondering about authorship for students. For instance, how do you handle students who want first authorship? I'm struggling to get students to write anything unless they are given first authorship, even on data I have collected and analyzed before they were in the lab. Like you have noted, it is a lot of work when students are first authors. Do you teach or cultivate an understanding of authorship issues in your labs?
I must say that's a new, I have not experienced sort of a situation like this where a student, I don't know, have you had something like this, Paul?
So I would say a couple of things for this. The important thing for authorship issues is two things. It is valuable for undergraduates in particular just to even be co-authors on papers. So the students should understand that it is somewhat of a privilege to be asked to be on an author list as some part. So if they're asked to write a small part or something, they should understand that you don't just get to be a co-author. You have to do some appreciable amount of work to get a co-authorship. Now, for who's first author on something, generally speaking, and this has worked for me throughout my career with a lot of different students, is that when you want to have students involved in writing something, when you have a project from the beginning, you need to define who is the project lead and who's going to write it. Doing this ad hoc is hard, and it leads to messes a lot of times, and people end up fighting over stuff. So the best thing is when you start a project is to say you're the lead on this and you're going to write it up. And if it's too big a project, you have co-first authors and you define that up front. Now, for stuff that's been around for a while and you have someone taking over something, like what you've described with like something data that you've analyzed yourself and the project is further along and they're taking this over to kind of get it over the finish line, you just have to be clear about what your expectations are for them to be first authors on and why they would do this, right? And what the advantage is to them and what you would expect them to contribute.
Yeah. So, hi, Janelle. I would say the other thing is that I would give firm deadlines. If a student says, I want to be first author, and if they have to write the paper, just say, you got to have something to me by X and X by this date. And if not, then, and it's not going to happen. I think that there have
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that can work. That's also useful too, because if someone is serious about it and there's something like, well, you're the person that's volunteered to be first author. You said you wanted to do this. Okay, no one else is going to do that. Here's what I expect of you, and here's when you have to have it done by. Otherwise, I'm going to do it myself or have someone else do it. Because it's just, if it's something that has to be finished, you just have to communicate well and what the expectations are and what the time frame is.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question is asking you to weigh in on how review manuscripts are counted toward grants.
Well, they count. There's no doubt about that. It's still a publication, but it's not as impactful as a peer-reviewed manuscript, in general.
Right. I mean, it's good to have publications, but I mean, if someone's looking at your biosketch and your previous 5 years, you have 6 publications and 5 of them are review articles, they're not going to consider that they'd be particularly productive as a researcher. I mean, they're good, but I mean, you have to have a balance. I mean, more realistically, you'd want to have it the other way around. You'd have, in your previous 5 years, you have 6 or 7 publications, you have 1 or 2 review articles, and the other ones are data papers. That's a more reasonable expectation.
Okay, next question has a couple parts as well. How do you deal with extended review time? How often do you contact the editor? I've experienced issues with finding reviewers and delaying review.
Well, I mean, it's a common problem. I mean, there is a reasonable, the journal should have some information on their website about how long it typically takes, right? Most journals are trying to be somewhat transparent about this. So it'll say average time to first decision, average time to acceptance and publication. So those are the metrics you should watch for. And when you submit to a journal, if a journal doesn't disclose that, it's suspicious. But if if they have it on their website that it takes only the average time to first decision is 2 weeks, and you haven't heard anything in 2 weeks, then you should email the managing editor or handling editor and see, is there a problem? Editors are very open to you sending them more, because a lot of times it really is a struggle finding reviewers. And editors are actually quite open to you sending them more suggestions. They'll check for conflicts, right? So that's not really a concern. I mean, if you're saying, well, I can't, I've sent out 20 invites and I've only got 1 person to agree to review this, then say, well, could you maybe send me more suggestions? Maybe send me an extra 5 names of people you think might be willing to act as a reviewer. And that usually works out fine. I mean, obviously, it can't be someone you're publishing with or your mentor or anything. They won't take those as serious suggestions.
But it's certainly appropriate to contact the editor if things are taking too long. Don't to sit and wait and hope.
Yeah. Again, look at what it's supposed to be. So you'll see if it's outside the range. If that journal says it only takes 3 weeks and you're up to 3 weeks and you haven't heard anything, you should say, hey, you've had my manuscript for weeks. Is there a problem? Or something, just be polite, be considerate. I mean, everybody's professional about this stuff. So.
Okay, and sort of a related question. It says, I'm struggling with turnaround time on manuscripts. How long is too long to wait for a manuscript to get beyond the editor's desk? And is it a bad idea to withdraw a publication?
This is similar to the other one. If we understand as editors that, you need to get your stuff published. If it is not going anywhere, so it's the same thing as if you had something that took a while to get reviewed and it came back and there was a whole bunch of unreasonable requests and you said, I'm just going to withdraw it and send it elsewhere. People know that. So if you sent something in and you thought you were kind of on a time crunch and you wrote in your cover letter that you would appreciate it if they would give you a thumbs up, thumbs down within a couple of weeks and you haven't heard anything, you could give them a warning shot and say that, look, I'm really sorry. I'd really like to have this in your journal, but I did indicate in my cover letter that I don't really have a lot of time. If you can't find a reviewer, I'd really like to send it somewhere else and see if that gets their attention. But it's not going to hurt you to withdraw something if it's taking someone too long.
Right. but always be nice.
Always be nice. You don't want to burn bridges, because there's often, there may be something going on that you're unaware of. I mean, everybody's human, and stuff's happening in their life and in their professional career and at the journal itself. So
Yeah.
Okay. Next thing in the Q&A is actually a comment that somebody in the meeting will see us at AberCams next week. So that's exciting. We will be in the exhibit hall. And then last question I currently see says, one time we did the experiments and addressed all the questions the reviewers raised, but the reviewer still rejected the manuscript. Any suggestions in this case?
I would say,
so move on. That's the first thing. And then it depends if it was rejected for, there's just a disagreement. There's not much you're going to be able to do about that. So you don't want to like bother the editor and say that you disagree. I mean, that's not going to help you, right? I mean, because they're going to be like, well, I mean, this has happened to me before too, and I'm also an editor. I mean, it's like if you write them an angry letter, what will that gain you? It's not going to help. Now, on the other hand, when I thought I've been treated unfairly, I have written to the editor and expressed my displeasure, because I mean, that's different. And you have to, when you do that, you have to be specific. You can't just be like, I am annoyed that you rejected my manuscript. That is not helpful. But if there was something they rejected and you're like, this was unfair, you have to be very specific about what it was unfair. And sometimes that might get your manuscript re-reviewed. Most likely you won't hear anything about it, but it's worthwhile to mention if you think it's been treated unfairly. I had one journal some years ago that is actually a reasonable journal, and they treated one of my manuscripts, I thought, extremely unfairly. We had a really aggressively negative reviewer who had very unfounded criticisms that we rebutted, and we answered a bunch of their stuff and rebutted their other ones. And they were very negative. And the other reviewers, we had 3 reviewers, and the other 2 were extremely positive, and they ended up rejecting the paper. And one of the reasons that they rejected it was because, and for those of you who are this always makes me laugh, one of the findings in the paper, it was just one, it was only like a minor thing, it wasn't a major part of the paper at all. The p-value was 0.051, and it was only like a minor side thing. And that reviewer wrote like a paragraph about how this shouldn't be considered because of that. And that was that is just ridiculous. And anybody who knows anything about data analysis or anything knows how stupid that is. I mean, I could just round it off to 0.05, and it would, it said that is a dumb criticism. And that was one of the things I said to the editor when I wrote them a letter saying, I will never submit anything to your journal again or review for you, because this is really a bad practice. And, they occasionally do ask me for, the editor's turned over, they still ask me to review from time to time. And I write them a letter back saying, some years ago, I said I would never review for your journal again, and I never will. So
problem with journal reviews and grant reviews are not perfect, and that this happens to happened to me.
It happens to everybody. I mean, and the key is to think, do you really think you've been treated unfairly? And then you should bring it to the attention of the editor. And because as an editor, I've had people contact me and say they think this was unfair, and they'll give me reasons, and I'll say, okay, you know what, that's fine. If you're willing to take the time and have me send it out for review again and write a rebuttal, I'll do it for you. It'll just take a couple more months of your time. And several of those papers have been accepted. So, I mean, they're not necessarily wrong, right? I mean, people are professional about this. If you write them, say, I don't think this is fair, and this is why. If you have a reasonable editor, they'll read it, and they're authors too. They understand. I mean, they'll read that and say, you know what, if this was me, I would be annoyed at this too. And that seems reasonable. I will write a rebuttal, and we'll send it back to the reviewers, and we'll see if we can get it over the finish line. I've had several like that. I had one just a couple of weeks ago, and when it got accepted, it took a while, but when it got accepted, the author, who was someone I think they were in Brazil, they were extremely enthusiastic and happy that it finally got accepted, and they wrote me like a really effusive praise letter saying how great it was that we reconsidered and let them resubmit. And so, so it can happen.
Great.
All right. Well, I think those are all the questions that are in the Q&A. For anyone asking about copies of presentation materials, Anything that I have to share will be sent to you via the email that you used to register for today's event, including access to the session recording. So give us a few days to process that and we'll get the information out.
Thanks a lot for your attention and your questions. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.